Chapter 26 The Witch's Nightmare. If one could fly high enough and somehow get rid of all the fog, they would see Oldham's Bog was actually a great maze. The most harmless part of the maze, the outer ring, was where Riverpaw and Evercloud had met the vulture. The inner portion of the maze, however, had a much different reputation. In the villages around Everflame, nasty old men would scare children with tales of what they called the witch's nightmare. "Mind your elders," they would say, "or the witch'll get you and put you in her nightmare." They would make up stories of trolls, goblins, or any other thing they could think of to scare the children. Yet the truth was, no one who had ever entered the witch's nightmare had returned to tell the tale. So no one actually knew what horrors lay in wait. It was also said by the nasty old men of Everflame that the witch lived at the center of the maze. They would tell of a black castle covered with slime that towered into the sky and blotted out the light of the moon. They told of a darkness none could escape, and even the fell creatures that inhabited the nightmare stayed far away from the castle. They said the witch was a tall, thin woman with fingers like razors and eyes like ice. She sat upon a grotesquely decorated throne, a tyrant over the souls of children who had misbehaved. Unfortunately for Evercloud and Riverpaw, these fairy tale descriptions paled in comparison to the cold truth, for it was inside the witch's nightmare they had found the Tree of Death, and it was also there they had suffered such a tragic miscommunication with the vulture. When the fingers of the bog had reached out and captured them, they were brought to the witch's den. The den was at the center of the maze, but it was no grand castle that reached into the clouds. It was a pit that sank into the bowels of the earth. The walls, ceilings, and floors of the witch's den were black and oozed with slime. Now, far below the waters of Oldham's Bog, Riverpaw and Evercloud were trapped in a wretched cage. Evercloud scrabbled on the floor and searched for Riverpaw in the darkness, but everything he touched was cold, wet, and slick. "Riverpaw," Evercloud whispered. "Where are you?" "I'm over here," Riverpaw answered. "I can't move." Evercloud crawled in the direction of his cousin's voice and finally found Riverpaw. "Are you hurt?" Evercloud asked. "No," Riverpaw said, "but I've been bound." Evercloud felt around and found slimy vines across Riverpaw's legs, so he used his claw to cut them away. After he freed Riverpaw, they stood and bumped their heads on the ceiling. Crouching back to the floor, they felt around a little more and quickly realized they were in a cage. Their prison seemed to be made of the same vines as Riverpaw's bindings, so the two began to cut their way free. Suddenly, something screamed in the distance. It was sharp, brutal noise that only came once, and then silence followed. "What was that?" Riverpaw whispered. "I don't want to find out," Evercloud said. "Keep cutting." After a minute, they opened a seam in the cage and crawled outside. Still in total darkness, they stood with caution. "What do we do now?" Riverpaw asked and stretched to his full height. "Feel for a wall," Evercloud said. "Maybe we can follow it out of here." They groped for a wall, and when they found one, they moved along it slowly. Like everything else, the surface was smooth and slimy. Something dripped on Evercloud's head, and he startled. "What was that?" Riverpaw said. "I don't know," Evercloud said, his heart beating furiously. "Something dripped on me." He had flattened himself against the wall in fear, and as he moved away again, Evercloud realized the blades of his claw had punctured holes in the wall. "Riverpaw, look," he whispered. The bear saw light coming from the holes and decided to make them larger. They widened with ease, and Riverpaw ripped an opening large enough to pass through. It seemed everything in this place was made of oozing vines. Silently, Riverpaw and Evercloud moved out into the light. Shockingly, they found themselves against the wall of a large pit that descended in steps. They stood on the top ledge, and above them the wall shot up a great distance. It was still very dark, but the pit was open to the sky and allowed the moon to light its depths. The cousin looked at the moon. and it had never seemed so small to either one of them. "Do you think we could climb out?" Riverpaw asked. Another scream rent the air, and they glanced to the wall on the other side of the pit to see what looked like a giant green starfish. The creature writhed against the wall at the top ledge. "That thing has to be 10 times bigger than you," Evercloud whispered to Riverpaw. They stood motionless and watched as it moved against the wall of the pit. "Wait," Riverpaw said. "It looks like it's moving away from the wall." "Riverpaw, we need to hide, now!" Evercloud said in a panic. The giant starfish pulled away from the wall as the cousins rushed back through the tear and into the darkness. They peeked out and realized what they had thought was a starfish was merely the legs of the witch. The top half of her body had torn through the wall into a cage just like the one Riverpaw and Evercloud were in. The cousins looked around and now understood the pit walls were filled with cages, and the cages were filled with the unfortunate creatures the bog had taken prisoner. The screams they had heard were the cries of animals the giant witch had chosen as her next meal. They watched as the witch slithered down to the center of the pit, her giant tentacle legs carrying her gelatinous body down the steps. She was terrible to see. Her flabby torso was covered in arms that might have been considered human if there had only been 2 of them. Yet it seemed as though there were 24. The witch's face oozed, and her mouth gaped like the snare of a Venus flytrap. But what stood out most was the witch's hair, if it could even be called hair, for upon her head sat a nest of fire that lit the pit walls red. The very sight of her made both Evercloud and Riverpaw tremble. As she slithered to the bottom of the pit, she sang a rhyme only the blackest souls could ever know. "The hammer cracks, the hammer breaks, the hammer splits 'em narrow. The bones of legs and arms and head for sweet and tasty marrow." The witch reached the bottom of the pit and stood upon a bone-covered platform. She reached underneath it with one tentacle leg and pulled out a hammer that seemed tiny next to her massive bulk. "That must be the hammer we need," Evercloud whispered. The witch stopped singing and stood still. "I hear voices and whispers," she said. Her voice was both low and high in pitch, discordant and petrifying to hear. She turned her head and scanned the walls. Riverpaw and Evercloud tried to close the rip as much as they could, hoping she wouldn't notice them. They held their breath and peered out of the crack that was left. Thankfully, they had gone unnoticed, and the witch hummed again, slithering back up the steps of the pit. She returned to the hole which she had come from, and plunged her grotesque body back inside. "How are we going to get the hammer?" Evercloud asked. "We watch, wait, and hope we're not next," Riverpaw answered. Barely a minute had passed before the witch pulled away from the wall, and Evercloud and Riverpaw again tried to close the tear. She moved down the steps and placed the hammer back underneath the platform. Then the witch sat down and fell asleep. The cousins watched her silently, unwilling to do anything to interrupt her slumber. After minutes, Riverpaw glanced at Evercloud with a look that suggested he might say something, but Evercloud shook his head violently, and the bear understood. They were trapped, and too frightened to move, so they did the only thing they could. They waited. Time passed so slowly it felt like torture, and every listless flutter the witch gave jolted Evercloud and Riverpaw. They had been so scared for so long that their bodies were exhausted, and their minds grew paranoid. Evercloud thought they were going to starve to death, and worried their bodies wouldn't have the energy they needed to escape, even if they tried. As slowly as he could, he took off his pack and opened it. Riverpaw looked at him in horror, trying to will him to be still. Smoothly and silently, Evercloud produced some cheese and bread from the pack. He broke the cheese and handed the majority of it to Riverpaw. Riverpaw took it in his mouth, chewed and swallowed, never making a sound. Evercloud did the same with the small amount of cheese he kept for himself. Now they both looked at the bread, and Evercloud reached for it, but Riverpaw shook his head. "No," he mouthed. Yet Evercloud wasn't looking at his cousin. He picked the bread up and began to tear it. The crust cracked, and Riverpaw cringed. They looked anxiously out at the witch, but thankfully she had not stirred. Evercloud handed a large hunk of bread to Riverpaw, who ate it whole, afraid to make noise chewing. Evercloud chewed his piece carefully with wide eyes. They had eaten without incident, and silently breathed a sigh of relief. Unfortunately for Riverpaw and Evercloud, their stomachs did not understand the importance of silence. They had felt what it was like to digest after a long fast, and they voiced their opinions for more. The two travelers looked at each other terrified as their stomachs gurgled loudly. Down in the pit below, the witch opened her eyes. "Time for more foods," she hissed. The cousins stared with bated breath as the witch slithered up the steps and away from them. She reached the wall across the pit and tore into a different cage. Again, screams blasted the air. "She didn't take the hammer," Riverpaw said. "This is the only chance we'll have." They slid out of the tear in the wall and descended the stairs without caution. Across the pit, the witch writhed in the darkness as Riverpaw and Evercloud moved as quickly as possible. Nothing mattered but the hammer. As they reached the platform, Evercloud turned to Riverpaw. "Get the hammer," he whispered. "I have to find the candle and the matches in my pack. When you get back up here, we can light the candle and get out of here." Riverpaw nodded and dove under the platform while Evercloud dug through his pack. It made a lot of noise, but he couldn't help it. Speed was all that mattered. He felt the candle at the bottom of the pack and took it out. Now for the matches. Riverpaw poked his head up above the platform with the hammer in his mouth and then climbed to where Evercloud searched. "Let's go," Riverpaw said with the hammer between his teeth. I'm trying, Evercloud said. "The matches aren't in here. I can't find them." "Oh, no, no," Riverpaw moaned as if he was in pain. Evercloud stopped digging and looked up, his face pale and haunted. "I never had the matches," he said, realizing why Riverpaw moaned. "Thomas had them." Suddenly the walls of the pit glowed red, their damp and oozing surface reflecting the light of a fiery nightmare. The witch had come out of the wall. "What's it doing on our throne?" the witch yelled, her voice shaking the platform and piercing their ears. "The foods is out of its cage!" The cousins cowered in fear as her giant tentacles propelled her toward them. "It thinks it can have a hammer?" she yelled. "We'll bite it apart!" The witch opened her mouth wide to reveal rows and rows of razor-sharp teeth, all coming at them like stars falling out of the sky. "We have to run!" Riverpaw yelled. "We won't make it!" Evercloud yelled back. "Just hold on to me! Whatever you do, don't let go!" The witch was upon them, and she bent down to take them in her mouth. Evercloud could see his reflection in each of her gigantic black eyes. He raised his fist into the air, holding the candle as high as he could, and the witch's fire came down upon both of them.